Now, first of all, apologise that I'm going to repeat some of the things that has already been said, and in particular the idea that this is a political project. I'm particularly pleased that the title of this session is about the effect of austerity on community services and the movement. And with the movement, I want to focus on the trade union movement. I say I'm pleased with that because it's often failed to be recognised, and we need to get people to recognise that the attacks on wages, the attacks on terms and conditions, the attacks on individual employment rights, the attacks on collective employment rights, and therefore the attack on the trade union movement is part and parcel of the overall austerity programme. So the attacks on communities, the attacks on services go hand in hand with the attacks on the trade union movement. As part of the political project which has been mentioned, they want to create a pool of reserve, a reserve army of labour. They want to create unemployment and a desperate labour force, which in turn is used to drive down terms and conditions of those in work. And we hear people saying, and we applaud them for saying, that austerity isn't working. The problem with that, of course, is that it presupposes that austerity is designed to make things better for the majority of people. The reality is that the political project is to make things worse for the majority of people. It's driven by an ideology. It's the same ideology which we had during the Thatcher years and which led Nigel Lawson to famously remark that unemployment is a price worth paying. And it's an ideology that is based on dividing the working class. That's why you continually get this drip feed about scroungers and people who are feckless and don't want to work, in order to drive a wedge between people who are in work and people who are out of work, between the able-bodied and the disabled, between those who were born here and migrant workers. These are the type of things that are used to divide the working class. This political project is an attack on the working class across the board, and it requires a response by the working class across the board. And it's an absolute scandal, of course, that 1 million people are now relying on food banks to get by. But within that figure, according to the Trussell Trust, 23% of those who visit food banks are people who are in work. They are visiting food banks because of low wages. Now, the government and the Bank of England are now telling us that the trouble is over, that there's some dawn about to beckon, that our wages are going to rise, and the inflation, is basically destroyed. Well, the reality is that the latest figures from the Income Data Service show the following: that rents are up by 26%, food is up by 24%, and energy costs up by 40%. They also show that full-time wages have fell by £2,000 in real terms since 2010. We have 1 in 4 people in Scotland who are earning less than the living wage. We have public sector workers who have had years of pay freezes or pay caps, and we have 10% of the private sector who have not had a wage rise for the last 6 years. They also tell us, of course, that unemployment is down. Well, there are still far too many of our young people who are trapped in unemployment. But when you look at the type of jobs that are being created, then these jobs are insecure, precarious employment, employment agencies, self-employment, 0 hours, and the like. And I'm not just talking here about the McDonald's and the Burger Kings in this world, bad enough as that is. But the figure released this week is that 1.8 million people are now on 0 hours. And within that figure, there are 67,000 who are employed in the NHS, 307,000 in the care sector, and overall 24% in the public sector are on 0 hour contracts. There's also the fact that 40% of the new jobs that are supposedly being created are defined as self-employed. So these are people who are going into work where they have no right to sick pay, no right to holidays, and no right to basic employment rights such as the right to claim unfair dismissal. And as if that wasn't bad enough, it's of course underpinned by an attack on individual employment rights per se. The extension of the right to claim unfair dismissal to 2 years, the restriction on the ability to claim industrial injury claims, the cuts in the Health and Safety Executive and in the Gangmasters Licensing Authority, and of course the introduction of fees to access employment tribunals, which has resulted in almost an 80% drop in the amount of people who are able to claim justice. And alongside that, we of course have the attacks on collective rights, the attacks on trade union facility time, and the attacks too on the right of trade unions to campaign politically. In my view, the Lobbying Act, more accurately described as the Gagging Act, is another piece of anti-union legislation. It is designed to try and tie the trade union movement up during electoral periods and probably beyond that, in all kinds of red tape, and to try and suppress their ability to influence the political agenda. Actually, perhaps even more worrying than that, prevents or attempts to prevent some things like broad campaigning against racism and fascism, and it descends into the absolute ridiculous. I have been advised, for example, by our lawyers, that if during the course of the general election one of our branches was to invite a political speaker, then that's fine under the Lobbying Act, providing that every single person in the room is a member of Unite and the political speaker is a member of Unite. That's deemed to be Unite member communication. However, should one of the members not be able to get somebody to look after the kid for the night and bring along their child to the meeting, then it breaches the Lobbying Act in terms of expenditure because the child is unlikely to be a Unite member. Absolutely incredible and all designed to try and prevent us from campaigning politically. And of course, we now have the proposal to introduce an overt other piece of anti-union law with the restrictions on balloting and how trade unions arrive at a decision to take industrial action. Thresholds that, if they were applied to the politicians, would mean that the vast majority of them would have to forfeit their place in the House of Commons because they would not have reached those thresholds in terms of the electorate's approval. And they're doing this because they recognise that trade unions have got the ability to raise standards in the economy at a time when they want to suppress standards in the economy. They're doing it as well because they recognise that trade unions have got the ability to lead the fight back against austerity itself. My own union, has introduced community membership, where we are going out proactively to recruit and organise the unemployed, and to stand shoulder to shoulder with those who are at the cutting edge of the attacks on benefits, and indeed the attacks on services. There are some people in this room who are Unite community members and who have been involved, for example, in the campaign against the closure of day centres in Glasgow. And just as a wee aside on that, when we look at the services that are under attack, then you're talking about day centres, you're talking about nursery services, you're talking about provision of English as a second language, you're talking about introducing charges for community lets for young people. So you're talking about an agenda which is founded on inequality, that disproportionately affects women, young people, black and ethnic minorities, and disabled people. And tomorrow, my union will be organising demonstrations outside the offices of Maximus, the new organisation that has been brought in to replace the role played by ATOS in the so-called work capability assessment. Under the same rules and provisions that ATOS operated the system, and actually based in terms of their head office in London, in a building that is inaccessible for disabled people. So we will be protesting outside of those offices against Maximus in the same way that we demonstrated against ATOS. That great left-wing documentary Panorama, of course, revealed that every week 32 people in the UK die who were passed by ATOS as being fit for work. And if there's any stronger indictment of the austerity programme, then I don't know what that is. I know there's going to be a future session today about alternatives to austerity, but given what I've just said, I just want to perhaps suggest a couple. The first is, it was mentioned, the minimum wage. The first, in my view, is to replace the minimum wage with a living wage. When Jimmy Maxton introduced the first bill in his attempt to introduce a living wage in 1931 and included it in the ILP's programme called Socialism in Our Time, Maxton presented the case for the living wage as a case to address unemployment. It was based on increase in spending power, increase in demand, increase in consumption in the economy, and stimulating growth. And although it's morally correct that people should have a living wage, then perhaps we need to be presenting that economic argument that this is an alternative to unemployment and to austerity. The second is something that was briefly touched on earlier, and that is to restore collective bargaining rights for the trade union movement in order to bargain for wages beyond the statutory minimums. As has been commented on, the rate and scope of collective bargaining in 1978 was in excess of 80%, and it is now, it's not actually 25%, it's now actually 23% in terms of collective bargaining coverage. Now, they present this image of the bad old days of the 1970s. Well, it might have been a bad old time for them, but it wasn't a bad time for our class. Because when you look at the 1970s, when collective bargaining coverage was as wide as that, there was less poverty, less inequality, and less unemployment than what we have today. Within the restoration of collective bargaining rights, we should also, and this is something that the Scottish Government could do, we should also be looking at introducing sectorial bargaining to specifically set trade union rates of pay in those areas of the economy that is most open to exploitation and where, surprise, surprise, trade union in terms of membership is at its lowest. So we're talking here about the hospitality industry, and we're talking, for example, about the care sector industry. So what the Scottish Government could do is basically restore some of the wage councils models that we had, and thankfully we still have one in the form of the Agricultural Wages Board in Scotland, and we need to resist any future attacks and get rid of that as well. But they can set up these bodies where they force employers to come together with trade unions to set minimum rates of pay in those sectors of the economy. But all of that needs to be underpinned by a positive right for trade unions to organise and the right to strike. Because as John Hendy, the QC at Unite Conference put it, without that right to strike, collective bargaining can become collective begging. And as Jim Mortimer, a former General Secretary of the Labour Party, put it, the right to withdraw your labour is a fundamental difference between being a worker and being a slave. So the right to withdraw your labour, the right to strike, should be seen as a fundamental human right that should be introduced to underpin rights to collective bargaining. And the beauty of all of that, for those who say that the public purse is skint and we need to cut public expenditure, the beauty of all of that is that it doesn't cost the public purse a brown penny. It costs employers. It causes those who have the wealth. But it doesn't cost the public purse. Because at the same time as we've had that stagnation in wages that I mentioned, according to the stats for the FTSE 100 chief executives, their earnings have went up by 243%. So the fundamental issue here isn't that we're not producing wealth in the country, it's the fact that we're not distributing that wealth to those who have actually created it. So the case against the cuts in services, the case against the attacks on benefits and benefit sanctions, the case against the attacking communities, and the case against the deepening poverty and inequality that brings goes hand in hand with the case to strengthen the trade union movement. So the immediate objective of the left and the trade union movement should be to educate our members about the class nature of the attack that has taken place, to get them to recognise that their comrades are people who are out of work as well as people who are in work. We need to organise politically as well as industrially. And I know the camera is rolling, but in some cases that might mean in defiance of things like the Lobbying Act. And we need to agitate for a programme of alternatives to austerity, and one that places a demand for trade union rights alongside, not separate from, the demands of communities and the demands of those who are fighting to protect the services upon which they rely.